All right, guys. Welcome to a special segment of Market Mondays. We are in Washington, D.C., and we are with Representative Lauren Underwood of the 14th District of Illinois. Thank you for hosting us again today. And we are with the Deputy Secretary of the United States Treasury, Wally Adeyemo.
Well done. Appreciate it.
First and foremost, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to have a couple of minutes with us. Appreciate it.
Happy to do anything for you, but especially for my favorite congresswoman.
Smart.
So I'll start off with the first question as far as access to capital through community lenders, right? That's something that is a big thing. We recently spoke with the vice president last week about access to capital, especially when it comes to small business entrepreneurs, black entrepreneurs. So can you talk about that topic and what you guys have done?
Yeah, and I think you've spoken to the person who's driving much of this work, the vice president. But under her leadership, when she was a senator, they approved $9 billion of money that could go to community development financial institutions and black-owned banks throughout this country to be able to lend to small businesses. $1.4 billion of that money went to black-owned institutions, so black-owned banks, that allows them to give loans to community-based small businesses. And one of the things that I'm proudest of over the last 3 years is we've seen the number of black-owned small businesses double in America. But when I sit down with small business owners, and I'd consider you also small business owners, the two things they say that they need is access to capital, and the second one is access to customers, because having customers and building that up allows you to get access to more capital. So we've taken a lot of steps to make sure that we've gotten that $1.4 billion into the hands of black-owned banks who can then lend to black-owned businesses so they can grow. But we're also focused on making sure that we find customers for those black-owned businesses as well.
Thank you again for having us. One of my favorite topics to talk about, and everybody in our audience knows, is semiconductors. We talk about how we invest in a bunch of them. I want to talk about the Semi and Science Act, because maybe most people aren't familiar with it, its implications and its importance. We talk about having chips made here. We spoke about TSM having development in Arizona, Micron, Global Foundries, all these companies. Talk about the importance of having the United States at the forefront of leadership in the space.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we just looking back a little while and go back to the pandemic and think about the things that were hard to get. You couldn't get a new car, you couldn't get an iPad, you couldn't get a bunch of things. And the reason you couldn't get it was because ultimately there were these little things called chips that they couldn't have. So there was a bunch of new cars sitting on lots all over the country, but they couldn't sell them because they were lacking these processors, these microelectronic chips. And what the president said is, like, we should never be in a position again where the United States isn't producing these things that are critical to the economy of the future. You need these chips to be able to produce everything from the cell phone that you have on your lap there to your iPad, to anything today. So the U.S. should be a leading producer, but we shouldn't only produce them in certain communities. We should produce them in places where we're going to create jobs for people who have been left out and left behind for so long. So you look what the president just did a few weeks ago. He made an announcement in Syracuse where Micron is deciding to open up a huge factory, just to put it simply. And that factory is going to power the economy in that region and create thousands of jobs and economic opportunity for people who have been left out and left behind. So part of our goal is making investments and making sure that we can build these chips, but also to make those investments in communities where people have underinvested for too long.
From your perspective, what do you think the role of the Treasury should be in addressing some of the economic inequalities that we're seeing in the country?
One of given my background and who I am, I think deeply about how we make sure that the work the Treasury Department gets to communities that have been left out and left behind for too long. But I'm also supported by a boss who thinks about this as well. And what Secretary Yellen says is that the best way to grow the American economy, to do what's best for all Americans, is to invest in communities where potential exists, but opportunity hasn't for too long. So by making sure that we get access to capital, to Black small business owners, to Latino small business owners, and allowing them to hire people in their communities, to invest in those communities, to build out that economy. It's not only good for those communities, it's good for the entire U.S. economy. People often fail to realize that today, Black-owned small businesses employ 1.3 million Americans. They have a combined payroll of over 1.7 billion. That should double. That should grow because we're not only in the business of making sure that Black incomes grow, and over the last 3 years, they've grown faster than other incomes, but also that Black wealth generation grows because we know that building wealth within that community will translate to a stronger communities that will translate to a stronger U.S. economy.
So inflation is the invisible killer of wealth, especially over the last couple of years. We've seen inflation that a lot of people have never seen in their lifetime before, and it's affecting everyday people. So I want to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. Can you explain that, and how has the implementation been beneficial to the average everyday American?
Top focus for the secretary, for the president, for the vice president, for myself every day is doing everything we can to cut costs for Americans, to make sure that you have more money at the end of the month than you have spent, so that you start to build up wealth and savings and the ability to invest in your future. And the Inflation Reduction Act was focused on that and continues to be focused on that. One of the biggest expenses that people continue to have is filling up their car. Paying for energy for their house and in other places. So what the Inflation Reduction Act is, it puts in place a number of incentives that will allow you to reduce the cost of energy. Everything from giving you a tax incentive to put in for repairs to your home that will be energy efficient. It'll help you cut the cost of that. If you're looking to buy a new car or a used car, giving you a tax incentive for buying an energy efficient car that will not only be cheaper because of the cut cost from our tax incentive, but because it's going to cost you less because you're not going to need to put gas into that car going forward. But in addition to cutting costs there, we also want to reduce some of the costs that people face from buying prescription drugs. And part of what the bill does is it caps the amount people pay for insulin to $35 if you are someone who is a senior. But what we found is that by taking that step from the federal government and saying that we're going to start with seniors, we've seen a number of the companies follow suit and say that, okay, we're going to cut that cost for all Americans. So we're very focused on using the Inflation Reduction Act, but every other tool we have to try and reduce costs for the American people. But we also know that in addition to reducing costs, we want to increase incomes so that you have more money in your account. One of the things that we're proudest of is that for Black Americans in particular, our incomes are growing faster than inflation, 7% faster than inflation at the moment. And we think that that's the type of thing that we want to continue and build upon going forward.
That is a very encouraging number. Something else that is a huge cost to many Black homes is the cost of living, right? Either I'm renting or owning a home. We know interest rates are at 7.5%. I wonder if there's policies or plans to figure out initiatives, and we spoke to the vice president about this as well, and she gave some insight to it. How do we make home ownership, which we know is a key to wealth creation, how do we make it more affordable for the next generations?
And I think for most Americans, in particular Americans of color, the greatest source of wealth is your home. That is the thing that you use to build wealth that you potentially will become generational wealth. And unfortunately, because of generations of discrimination, Black and Latino households have had access to homes far less than others. So a big part of our goal is to build more housing, because the reason that part of the reason the costs are so high in terms of housing is because there's not enough of it. Not only in urban communities, but in rural communities, but all over the country. So one of the things the president has proposed is additional incentives, both in terms of helping with down payment assistance, because I know that for example, for myself, when I wanted to go buy a home, it wasn't like my parents were able to give me down payment assistance because they didn't have wealth. They hadn't built generational wealth. So the government wants to help people who are looking to buy homes with down payment assistance. We also want to take steps to encourage communities to change zoning laws, because Another challenge we have is that in many of these communities that are nice, they want to prevent you from being able to build additional housing, which means that you're restricting the ability of new people to move in. So we've also, in Congress, submitted a bill that will create incentives where the federal government will give money to communities that change these restrictive zoning laws in order to make sure that you're able to build more housing that first-time home buyers can get into. Ultimately, building more housing is going to be the key. But in addition to building that housing, we need to create opportunities for first-time homeowners to be able to get into that housing. You said you spoke to the Secretary of Education earlier, and I think one of the challenges we have, and I had this challenge too, was that for a number of Black Americans who want to buy their first home, they're coming into that with a lot of debt, school debt. And I know that paying off school debt was something, as I spent most of my career in public service, was hard. So the idea that we've created loan forgiveness programs not only is something that is a good thing to do, but it creates real opportunity for people to, instead of investing their incomes in paying off that debt, they can invest that income in investing in their first home and building up that wealth over time.
I think you have an incredibly remarkable story, but can you talk to us about how did you end up in this position and what initially made you interested in public service and finance?
Yeah, and I think like most people, the reason that I'm here is because of my parents. My mom and my dad both immigrated to this country, and they decided that they were going to get into public service themselves. My dad was and is an educator, my mom a nurse, and they taught us the importance of serving our communities. And for me, I had no idea that I'd ever get a chance to serve in a place like the Treasury Department. I'm the first Black American to be in my job. And part of that for me, and the reason I got here was because ultimately I started out thinking about what could I do I went to school in a community where the school I went to was a majority minority. And when I went to college, I recognized that not only was it a place where no one looked like me, no one was from those types of communities, and it got me interested in the question of why that was. And ultimately, from my perspective, part of what drove that was I lived in a community where there was a lot of talent, but there wasn't a lot of opportunity. So it got me engaged in the question of what does it take to create opportunity, and a big part of that is economics. A big part of that is capital. A big part of that is just access to information, and that led me to go end up working for another skinny Black man with a funny name named Barack Obama, and to get a chance to work in his administration for 8 years.
So from an educational standpoint, U.S. Treasury, people know that they print money, right? But can you explain, because we talked about a variety of different things, I don't think the general public is actually informed on what the U.S. Treasury Department actually does. So can you kind of just explain the purpose of the U.S. Treasury Department and what it encompasses?
So one of those key things is we do print the money, and one of the things I'm proudest of is that Janet Yellen, who is my boss, she signs the money. And Janet Yellen is the first woman in the over 200-year history of our country to be the Secretary of the Treasury. And a big part of what we focus on every day is what can we do to help grow the U.S. economy so that everyone can succeed. And what does that mean? It means trying to make sure that we get access to capital for communities throughout the country, rural and urban, through things like the CDFIs, through banks and financial institutions, but also thinking about what we can do to work with companies throughout the country to help create access for communities of color, but communities all over the country, again, to access to customers. Fundamentally, the thing that we know is that when American communities succeed, all Americans succeed. And in addition to printing the money, the IRS is part of the Treasury Department. And I know that for when we got here at the beginning of 2021, the IRS was answering 13% of the calls it received. That, wherever you're from, that's an F. But because the president and the secretary fought so hard as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, they got money to improve the IRS's services. And today, this year, the IRS answered more than 88% of their calls. But not only answered your calls, but also provided you with online tools. And why does that matter? Because on average, an American spends almost $200 a year to file their taxes. That's $200 that you could be using to invest in your children, invest in your families. And that's why this year with that money that the secretary and the president fought for, we created this thing called Direct File, which is a pilot that allows Americans to file their taxes for free directly with the IRS. And it also means that you're going to get your tax refund as quickly as possible. One of the things that I think I am the most focused on is making sure that Black-owned small businesses run by women, small businesses run by people of color, get access to tax credits that they deserve, which is money you can put in your pockets to invest in your business. The IRS has these resources. We want to make that more available to you. So from the standpoint of printing the money to collecting the money to helping to make sure that American small businesses in America can get access to their resources, those are the things the Treasury Department does every day.
Representative Underwood, I mean, when we talk about access, we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you, right? We're talking about, inviting Rashad to the State of the Union, us meeting with the Secretary of Education, us being here now at the United States Treasury. You've granted access to us. And so I want to talk about the importance of that, where that comes from. And you're historic in your own right, right? Like, you have a great history. So I would love for you to share with the audience, because it's inspiring, but it's also inspirational as well.
Well, I'm a fan of the show. And so in listening to the various guests that you all have on and the conversations that we have about building Black wealth and just being more savvy and taking advantage of opportunities to grow our personal incomes and buy homes and all these other things, I realized that there needed to be a more direct intersection with what's happening here in Washington, D.C., what's happening on Capitol Hill, and the debates and discussions that we're having every day on behalf of the American people. And so obviously the Black Caucus has a big emphasis on creating a Black wealth agenda. I do a lot of work to lower out-of-pocket costs for the American people, and I just wanted to be able to lift up that work in welcoming you to Washington, D.C., and creating a day where we could have that conversation really focus earnestly so that you could share that with your audience, right? We know that this is very much a time where people have to make a choice. We know that this is a time when people are really surveying, have they made progress over the last several years? Do they feel like life is better right now? And there's so much information that people just don't have, right, because of lack of access. And so when we're in institutions like the Capitol, when we're in institutions like the Treasury, when you're at the White House, those are the people's house. And, there might be perceived barriers to entry. And I want folks to know that, I work for the community, and it's my job to make sure that you know what we're doing on your behalf. So when you hear the Deputy Secretary say that he's focused every day on increasing access to capital, I hope people take that to heart. And even if it's a program with this crazy acronym, it doesn't mean it's not for you. It means that we really need you to apply and to go ahead and submit those forms so that you can get your loans repaid, or you could get, a grant, or you could become a vendor and get a contract to, service your community, right? And I think that oftentimes for millennials, African Americans, we just don't always feel that these services and programs are for us.
Representative Underwood, I'm proud of you and I appreciate you.
Thank you.
If you could talk to your 21-year-old self, 25-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself, given the seat that you're in now, and would you do anything differently in your journey?
What I would tell my 21-year-old self is to 100% bet on myself. And I was always ambitious. I was a dreamer. I had big goals, but I didn't know that they could happen. I'm the youngest Black woman to ever be elected to Congress. I was elected at the age of 32. I was elected 10 years after I graduated from college. I'm a nurse. And I ran for office because my congressman lied to our community about his intentions to vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act and take away health care for people like me with pre-existing conditions. And I think that so many of us witness injustices every day, and we feel like we don't have agency. We feel like we don't have power. We feel like we can't make a difference. And if we, for some reason, think that we do have a voice that would matter, we're not willing to go all in to fight for that change. And I was just crazy enough to do it. But we won. I flipped a seat, I beat a Republican incumbent, and now I'm in my third term in the Congress, making a difference, expanding access to health care for millions of Americans every day through this Inflation Reduction Act that you heard the Deputy Secretary talk about. And so I just want folks to know that our voices are desperately needed in these halls in Congress, in institutions like the Treasury. We belong here. And we have to be informing the process, taking every opportunity to make our voices heard so that America works for all of us.
Deputy Secretary and Representative Lauren, thank you for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having us. We appreciate you.